Hi, this is David Roach from Independent Strategy and Quantum Economics. Whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you're at, hello. I'm going to talk today about Jackson Hole and the Fed Fest. Well, Jerome Powell, Chairperson, has given his speech, and this is what it means for your portfolio and what it means short and long term for the world economy. It's really a warm porridge speech. Everything is neither too hot nor too cold. Therefore, we will see probably in November a modest reduction in Fed direct intervention to buy bonds, so quantitative easing asset purchases, but small really and on the edge of things. But we will see no change in interest rates. And the markets will interpret this as saying, okay, well, the liquidity may go down a bit, but we have to remember that the United States economy is now probably over the peak of the sawtooth recovery and is actually declining towards a trend growth rate of 2% or less. So the liquidity which is being printed by the Fed will still be well in excess of what is needed to run the economy as a real economy, an economy producing things and services that people need and buy. So actually, in liquidity terms, this Fed meeting is probably neutral to slightly pro asset price inflation. The second thing is that, of course, there will be no increase in Fed fund rates until the US economy shows the characteristics which are laid down in the new Fed framework. And those characteristics are that inflation has to be at 2%. It must run above 2% for a while, so overshoot is allowed, and labor markets must be at full employment. Now, according to the Fed metrics, which identify a lot of people who are still without jobs, and may or may not be, in my view, without jobs because of structural changes in the economy, which have been emphasized and accelerated by COVID. Nevertheless, the Fed counts them as part of the full employment equation, and therefore any rise in interest rates is a long way off. So if you're an asset manager, you say, okay, well, the discount factor for my equities and the yield on my bonds, certainly the short-term yields, are not going to rise enormously in the short term, so I'm fine on that front too. The markets will take it that way. Now, let me just go into the assumptions and thinking behind what the Fed has done, and then why I think it is wrong, which of course is just a view. What Jerome Powell says fundamentally is that, first of all, of course, as I've just said, there's loads of labor waiting for jobs. So there's no threat from wage inflation. I dispute that because I find that the wage levels in industries which are affected by supply constraints like hospitality, wage rates are rising by between 12 and 30% a year, depending on how you judge them and where you judge them. And I find that the wages which people expect were they to take a new job are running at an increase of approximately 30%. Now, both of those figures are percentages versus the beginning of this year, or rather, to be totally accurate, the end of December in 2020. So to say there's no wage inflation, I don't agree with the chairman or the chairperson. The second thing he says is that the inflation of the United States is purely transitory. Now, as you know, transitory is a word in the English language which has all but lost its meaning because it is being used so often by the Fed. It is of itself a form of verbal inflation, which debases the language. But moving away from that observation, which is semantic, back to the economic, the reason why that is the wrong assumption is the following. First of all, the US economy suffers from inflation, let's say, in three key areas: healthcare, one. Two is used automobiles, cars. And the third is, of course, restaurant services reopening. Now, what Mr. Powell says is that this inflation will go away because it's just to do with friction in the machine, sand in the car engine. I think that is wrong, and I think it is wrong for a very specific reason. If you look at US inflation, those three causal factors, let's say hospitality, health, and used cars, are indeed not present in most of the economies, the 27 economies we monitor globally. But inflation is present in 22 out of 27 of those economies. It has different sources. There is food price inflation of 30%. There is labor price inflation because skilled labor, which is what is now required, is short in supply. There is inflation stemming from industrial raw materials of between 25 and 30% a year. There is the cost of a container to move what is manufactured in these economies, which has risen by approximately 350% year on year. And I can go on. So different countries have different inflation. But to say that because the US has an idiosyncratic type of inflation present in only 3 or 4 sectors, which will vanish, is stretching it a bit when you come to look at the world. And the world has got inflation, and it is coming from lots of different sources in different places. But the commonality is there is inflation. And there is another commonality, and that is that these countries are doing something about it. In most of these countries, which have, say, between 6 and 10% inflation rates, we are seeing central banks tighten. They are reacting and saying, this is inflation, it is real inflation. Whereas the Fed is saying, well, our expectations, which are mainly those of academics, they are telling us that it is not inflation, it's just temporary. I think the main difference between the US and those other countries which are doing something about inflation is the pain threshold. I think the US has lost its ability to actually confront pain and accept it as a part of regulating the economy, running things properly. And I think that will come home to roost. Now, when does the roost happen? When does the rooster cry? When do you want to get out of your financial assets and put it all into Bitcoin or gold or under the bed or whatever? I think the danger signs are the following. It is really the legacy effects of the pandemic. What are those legacy effects? Number one is deglobalization and the return to national, if not nationalistic, economies. That is onshoring by another name with a political layer of custard plastered on the top. What this does is to substitute one inefficient supply side chain for an efficient supply side chain, which naturally raises costs and therefore ultimately prices. That's number one. It may be a good thing to produce things at home rather than in China. I'm saying a good moral thing, or it may be kinder for society, but don't pretend that it is more efficient because it is not. Now, the second thing which I think we must is going to impact things going forward is big government. Big government is essentially coming out of the pandemic. It is a given. Government has grown by 20% of GDP. Government debt to GDP now starts at around 130% of GDP most places, whereas before going into the pandemic, the golden rule, at least in the European Union, was a somewhat mythological and silly, but nevertheless a golden rule of 60% of GDP. So there is no arguing that government has got big. You will have to make a very sophisticated non-deflationary form of deflation to pretend that it is ever going down. Because once bureaucracies grow, by their very nature, they do not go down, they self-perpetuate. So we are stuck with governments which are huge. We are also stuck with huge inequalities in society. The difference between the winners and the losers, between the skilled and the unskilled, between the rich and the not rich during the pandemic has gapped like a bear's mouth about to eat you. The extremes are more extremes than they ever were before. Now, in certain countries like China, we have new ways being thought up to deal with this. It's called shared prosperity. It's a kind of a creation of a state-sponsored little Sweden without a vote. And it's a very nice idea, and it's meaningful because ideas like that to cope with inequalities in China, once they are mooted, they tend to happen. But in the West, you can only make them happen if you get votes. So big government will stay because it is going to have to subsidize the less skilled, the less fortunate, the less wealthy, in order to buy their votes to stay in power. Now, by its very nature, that sort of financing by government will be anti-productivity. It is a choice to be made by society, a kind of society, but a less productive one. But the bottom line is that that size of government, getting bigger for sound equality flattening or creating measures of permanent nature in society, will be less productive and more inflationary. There's no way that we are going to get away from that. And if you take these two factors together, then you are looking at inflation down the road, which is going to be embedded in society at a much higher level than it is today. And the transitory will turn out to be structural. Good night. Don't turn off the light. Talk to you soon.